This week I read about a guy who died and shows up at heaven's gate, and of course St. Peter is there to greet him as always because he's like the designated greeter, I guess. And Peter tells him, he says, "Before I can allow you into heaven, I need to ask you some questions." And so he asks him some standard stuff, did you love Jesus? Did you accept him? Et cetera, et cetera. And then he gets to this question where he says, "Can you tell me of a time when you did something strong and courageous in your life?" And the guy thinks for a moment, and he says, "Well, there was this one time when I saw this old lady being harassed by a bunch of motorcycle gang people, like real Hells Angels type guys. And so without thinking, I went right up to the biggest, meanest looking one, with arms like tree trunks and tattoos all over his body, and I kicked his bike over, and I said, 'You better leave her alone or else.' And while I distracted the guy, the lady was able to get away." And St. Peter said, "Wow, that really does sound courageous. When did that happen? I don't have any record of this." And he said, "Oh, it was about 3 minutes ago." For the last few weeks, we've been talking about strength and courage, and once again, nobody embodies those qualities, I think, better than the Old Testament hero Joshua. The book of Joshua itself, which tells the story of Joshua and the people of Israel moving into and taking the land of Canaan, is just jam-packed with astounding miracles and gripping battles and hair-raising adventures, edge-of-your-seat espionage, and supernatural intervention. And 2 weeks ago, we read in Joshua chapter 1 when God calls Joshua to be a man of vision and virtue and valor and victory. And then last Sunday, we witnessed Joshua and the people of Israel experience this surge of courage thanks to the capability and company and commemorating of God. And having crossed over the Jordan River on dry ground, the armies of Israel now face their first military test. If you have a Bible or an app on your phone, go ahead and open it up to Joshua 6. Joshua chapter 6. Chapter 6 is where things get a little bit complicated for Joshua. And in fact, that's where our story is going to start off, is the complication. The complication. Joshua's first complication as the new spiritual and military leader of Israel was a big one. The first obstacle on the path to the promised land was the walled city of Jericho. And the Bible says in Joshua chapter 6, verse 1, the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. Now, it may be good news that the people of Jericho were afraid of the Israelites, but the fact that Jericho's gates were tightly shut posed a significant problem. See, the city of Jericho had one of the longest occupational histories of any location in the world. It was around during and even long before the time of Abraham, when it was surrounded by these massive plastered ramparts as part of its fortification. And later, by Joshua's time, an even larger military wall had been built around that first wall, enclosing the inner wall as well as the entire city in solid stone. Jericho was by every definition a fortress which made for one of the most intimidating complications that Israel would face on their march through the Holy Land. But the thing is, life is full of complications, isn't it? And I'm not just talking about the, I lost my keys complications, or, my wife and I had an argument in the car on the way to church kind of complications. I'm talking about, huge, massive, faith-shaking complications. We all have our own Jerichos, seemingly insurmountable obstacles that impede our vision and instill fear in our hearts. The doctor says it's cancer. The judge tells you you'll have to wait until bail is set to see your son. The funeral director asks when we can work out a time to view the body. Your teenage daughter says, "I'm pregnant." Your boss says, "I'm sorry, but we're going to have to let you go." Your wife says, "I just don't love you anymore." When these sorts of things happen, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You feel overwhelmed and at a loss. These are Jericho experiences, faith-shattering complications. It would have been easy for Joshua to just say, no way, God. I mean, there's no way. Have you seen Jericho? The place is literally a fortress. We wouldn't stand a chance against them. Maybe we can just, go back to the wilderness and live out there for another 40 years. Having manna for every meal doesn't sound that bad after all. Maybe you've attempted to do the same, to just quit. Give up, surrender to life's challenges, and stop moving forward. And the real challenge, I think, in situations like these is holding on to your faith when life throws its worst at you. God encouraged Joshua, though, saying in verse 2 of Joshua 6, Jericho and its king and all its mighty warriors are already defeated, for I have given them to you. See, God wanted Joshua to understand that the battle was already won. No matter how impossible or improbable or unfeasible it might seem, God was with them. And the battle belonged not to Jericho or to Joshua, but to God. See, whatever obstacles we meet, whatever challenges we face, we are more than conquerors when God is on our side. As he did with Joshua, God has already given us victory. We just have to be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Trust that God is fighting for us. Like Joshua, though, we've also got to be careful to listen and obey the commands of God, no matter how counterintuitive they might be. And that brings us to the second part of this story, which is the command of God. See, when Joshua sought the counsel of God, the Lord gave Joshua his marching orders, literally. God told him in verse 3 and following, march around the city with your army once a day for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets made from horns of male sheep and have them march in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times and have the priests blow the trumpets as they march. Now, I don't know about you, but this sure doesn't seem like the right strategy for conquering a fortified city to me. Alexander the Great was a brilliant military tactician, and his strategy was simple. Always seize the high ground. Sun Tzu's Art of War tells us, know thy enemy. Both stratagems were successful and logically sound, and yet God obviously took a very different approach. What God told Joshua to do was completely and utterly ridiculous. I mean, some people have actually tried to rationalize this command by saying that the marching of several thousand Israelites, followed by their boisterous shouting, created enough vibrations to cause an earthquake, which then in turn resulted in the walls tumbling down. But I mean, let me assure you, no matter how much stomping and yelling you do, whether it's thousands or millions of people, you're not going to cause an earthquake. Earthquakes are caused by tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface, and no amount of stomping or shouting on the surface is going to cause those plates to shift. Now, this command was just absolutely without military merit, and yet that was the point. God wanted Joshua and the people of Israel to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this victory was not their doing. God and God alone would be responsible for those walls coming tumbling down. And that's a message that God has been trying to get across to his people since the dawn of humanity. We can't do it alone. The greatest enemy that mankind has ever faced is sin and death. It's an enemy that we could never overcome on our own, and God's strategy for overcoming sin and death seems foolish at first blush. In fact, the Bible even says in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 18, the message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. See, it doesn't make any sense judicially that Christ's death on the cross could atone for the sins of the world, but it does. God doesn't expect us to comprehend it all. He just expects us to believe, to have faith, to trust in Him to win that victory. We may not understand why certain things happen. We may never understand why certain things happen in our life or in the lives of those around us. We may never understand the reasons behind every command that God ever gives, but that's okay. Because success, victory, comes from obedience and faith. God doesn't need the smartest strategist or the most skilled soldier in the world to serve him. He's already the smartest and most skilled person in the world. What he needs are people who are willing to say, "Yes, Lord, I'll follow you wherever you lead." That's what he asked of Joshua. And by grace and faith, Joshua and the people of Israel won the victory, the conquest, which brings us to the last part of the story here, the conquest of Canaan. In the last part of chapter 6, we read in verse 20, "When the people heard the sound of the ram's horn, they shouted as loud as they could. Suddenly the walls of Jericho collapsed, and the Israelites charged straight into the town and captured it." And history, in case you're curious, corroborates the Bible's version of this story. John Garstang, one of the leading archaeologists to excavate the ruins of Jericho in the 1930s, reported this. He wrote, "The outer wall suffered the most, its remains falling down the slope. The inner wall is preserved only where it abuts to the citadel or the tower to a height of 18 feet. Elsewhere, it is largely to have fallen together with the remains of the buildings upon it into the space between the two walls, which was filled with ruins and debris. As to the main fact, then," he says, "there remains no doubt the walls fell outwards so completely that the attackers would be able to clamber up and over the ruins into the city." Isn't that amazing? If a city like this had been attacked by invaders from the outside using, all sorts of military equipment, the walls would have been knocked into the city. But these walls were blown out, allowing the Israelites to climb up and in. Again, reminding us that this was not their doing, it was God's doing. And from then on, word spread all throughout the Promised Land that God was with the Hebrews, and opposing tribes trembled in fear as the Israelite army marched from one victory to the next until the conquest of Canaan was complete. And finally, after more than 400 years, God's promises came to fruition. The fallen fortifications of Jericho served as a vivid reminder to the Jews that God always keeps his promises. And any battle fought in faith in the God of Israel is a guaranteed victory. And the Bible warns us that we, like Joshua, are in a pitched battle. Not a physical battle, but spiritual warfare. It says in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10 and following, "Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so that you'll be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. For we're not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." In other words, Satan uses a lot of different strategies and plans in order to crush us and defeat us. And maybe you're battling depression or drunkenness or debt or divorce or discouragement. The victory that Joshua and the Israelites enjoyed can be ours as well. God has given us the sword of the Spirit and the shield of faith to carry into battle as we seek to conquer any and every Jericho in our lives that threatens our spiritual health and our relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, we need to be clear, though, that doesn't mean that every single battle is going to go our way. It doesn't mean that life will always be full of sunshine and roses. Joshua and the Israelites had a lot of faith-stretching battles ahead of them. They experienced some losses and disappointments. But in the end, they triumphed. They conquered. Every battle that we fight is a victory if it increases our faith and gives us the strength to keep fighting. Paul, I think, asked the question that's on all of our hearts in Romans chapter 8, verse 35. He says, "Can anything ever separate us from Christ's love?" It doesn't mean he no longer loves us if we have trouble or calamity, or are persecuted or hungry or destitute or in danger or threatened with death? And then he answers a verse later and says, no. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loves us. Life is full of these Jericho-sized complications, difficulties and dilemmas that threaten our health, our happiness, and our holiness. And sometimes God's commands don't make a whole lot of sense. Love my neighbor. My neighbor's the one causing all the problems, God. Be patient and slow to anger. You don't know my boss or my kids. But the truth is, if we will just trust and obey, remaining faithful and full of God's Spirit, in the end, you'll see that we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Next week, we'll wrap up the life of Joshua, and we'll see how to finish well. In the meantime, though, maybe you're facing a Jericho-sized complication right now. I want to encourage you to remain strong and courageous. Don't give in. Don't turn back. Trust in God. Keep fighting the good fight. And if I can help you in any way, come talk with me. You can pull me aside after church, or you can call me at home, or even better, you can just come forward now while we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.